March 15th, 44 BC. A man walks into a building and never walks out. In the next 60 seconds, 23 daggers will find his body. The most powerful man in the world will collapse onto a marble floor, pulling his toga over his face so no one sees him die. And the world, the entire Roman world, will never be the same again. This is not just the story of an assassination. This is the story of how one man's death destroyed a republic, ignited a civil war, and gave birth to the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen. This is the last days of Julius Caesar. To understand why Caesar had to die, at least in the minds of the men who killed him, you first have to understand what he had become. By the spring of 44 BC, Julius Caesar was 65 years old. He had fought wars across 3 continents. He had conquered Gaul, modern-day France, in 8 years of brutal campaigning, killing over 1 million people and enslaving another million more. He had crossed the Rubicon River with his army, an act so illegal and so audacious that Rome held its breath for days before exhaling into civil war. He had defeated every rival, outlasted every enemy, survived every conspiracy. He was not just a general, not just a politician. He was, in the eyes of Rome, something approaching a god. And that was precisely the problem.
Rome was not a kingdom, it was a republic, a system built on the radical idea that no single man should hold absolute power. For 500 years that idea had held. 2 consuls elected every year, power shared, power checked, power balanced on the knife edge of tradition and law. Caesar had taken that knife and buried it in the Republic's chest. He had declared himself dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity, not for 6 months, as Roman law allowed in times of crisis, forever. In the marble halls of the Senate, in the whispered conversations of Rome's oldest families, a question was forming. If Caesar lived, what would become of Rome? And a darker question beneath it, what would become of them? The men in the shadows. His name was Marcus Junius Brutus, and he was Caesar's friend, not merely an acquaintance, not a political ally kept close out of convenience, a genuine, deep, complicated friendship, the kind forged over decades of shared history. Caesar had pardoned Brutus after the Civil War, when Brutus had fought on the losing side, had promoted him, trusted him. Some historians whisper that Caesar loved Brutus like a son, which makes what Brutus was about to do all the more devastating. By February of 44 BC, Brutus had become the quiet center of a conspiracy that was growing by the day. Around him gathered some of Rome's most distinguished men. Gaius Cassius Longinus, sharp, calculating, burning with personal resentment toward Caesar. Decimus Brutus, another close friend of Caesar, a man Caesar had named in his own will as a secondary heir. Senators, former generals, men who had, in many cases, been shown mercy and generosity by the very man they were now plotting to kill. There were eventually 60 of them.
60 men sharing the most dangerous secret in Rome. What is extraordinary, and what speaks to how desperately these men believed in what they were doing, is that not one of them betrayed the others. They called themselves the liberatores, the liberators. In their minds, they were not murderers, they were physicians. Rome was sick, infected by the disease of one-man rule, and the only cure was to cut out the source of the infection, quickly, decisively, before the Republic was lost forever. They told themselves the Roman people would understand. They told themselves that once Caesar was gone, everything would return to how it had been. The Republic would breathe again. The Senate would reclaim its power. Order would be restored. They were wrong about almost everything, but in the cold marble corridors of Rome in the winter of 44 BC, they could not yet see that. All they could see was the Ides of March approaching, and the work that needed to be done.
The man who knew here is the thing that haunts this story. Caesar knew, not the names, not the exact date, but the whispers had reached him, as whispers in Rome always did. There was talk of a plot, there were warnings from friends, there were omens, if you believed in such things, and Rome believed deeply in such things. A soothsayer had approached Caesar weeks earlier in the crowded streets of Rome, had looked at him with calm, steady eyes, and spoken 4 words that would echo through history.
Beware the Ides of March.
Caesar had laughed it off. His wife, Calpurnia, was not laughing. The night before the Ides, she woke screaming from a nightmare. Caesar's body, bloodied, held in her arms. She begged him not to go to the Senate that morning, pleaded with him to send word that he was unwell, to stay home, just one day. For a moment, Caesar wavered. He sent a message to the Senate postponing the session. He sat at home, and for one brief, fragile moment, it seemed as if history might pivot, might choose a different direction entirely. Then Decimus Brutus arrived at his door. Decimus, one of the conspirators, one of the men sharpening his dagger in secret, stood in Caesar's home and looked his friend in the eye. He told Caesar the Senate was waiting, that postponing would look like weakness, that Rome was watching. He smiled as he said it. And Caesar, the man who had crossed the Rubicon, who had stared down armies and civil wars and the endless brutality of the Gallic campaigns, Caesar stood up, wrapped his toga around his shoulders, and walked out of his house. He left behind his bodyguards. He had dismissed his Spanish escort months earlier, a deliberate, almost defiant act. He had said publicly
that living in fear of death is a poor life.
That a man who had lived as he had lived needed no protection. He walked through the streets of Rome in the morning light. Citizens called out to him. Some bowed, some watched in silence. The city moved around him the way it always did. Enormous, loud, ancient, alive. He did not look back. He never did. The Ides of March, the theater of Pompey. It is a bitter irony that history does not overlook. The Senate had been meeting here temporarily while their own building was under renovation, and Pompey, the great General Caesar, had defeated in civil war, whose severed head had been delivered to Caesar in a sack by Egyptian servants. Pompey's enormous stone statue stands at the far end of the hall. Caesar will die at its feet. He arrives late. The conspirators have been waiting for hours. Daggers hidden beneath their togas, hearts hammering. Every delay had stretched their nerves thinner. Every moment Caesar did not appear was a moment someone might lose their nerve, might confess, might run. But then, the doors open. Caesar enters. The Senate rises. Caesar moves toward his seat, and then a senator named Tullius Cimber steps forward with a petition, a request for his exiled brother to be recalled to Rome. A perfectly ordinary request, a reason to get close. Caesar brushes him off. Cimber grabs Caesar's toga with both hands and pulls it down from his shoulder. It is the signal. The first blade belongs to Publius Servilius Casca. He drives it toward Caesar's neck. Caesar moves, grabs the blade with his hand, cuts his palm, turns to Casca with fury in his eyes.
What is this betrayal, Casca?
For one suspended second, the world holds still. Then 60 men move at once. What follows is not an execution, it is a frenzy. A swarm of men, many of them Caesar's own friends, pressing forward with daggers in a space so tight and so chaotic that several conspirators accidentally wound each other in the confusion. 23 blades find Caesar's body. Later, the physician Antistius will examine the wounds and conclude that only one was truly fatal. A thrust between the second and third ribs, piercing the heart. The other 22 were panic, were rage, were 60 men trying to make themselves believe they had all done this equally, so that none of them had done it alone. Caesar fights. He does not collapse immediately. He struggles. He tries to stand. And then, when he sees Brutus among the men with a bloodied dagger, when he sees the face of his friend, something leaves his eyes. He pulls his toga up over his face. He does not want them to see him fall. Julius Caesar, dictator of Rome, conqueror of Gaul, the most powerful man in the world, slides to the marble floor at the foot of Pompey's statue, and the room goes silent. For one terrible moment, nobody moves. Then, everyone runs. For 3 hours, Julius Caesar's body lay alone on the floor of the theater of Pompey. No one came. The senators had fled into the streets of Rome, robes pulled over their faces, scattering in every direction. The conspirators had marched out together, daggers raised, shouting about liberty and the Republic, expecting the Roman people to flood into the streets, cheering, expecting gratitude, celebration, relief. Instead, they found silence, locked doors, shuttered windows, empty streets. Rome was not celebrating. Rome was terrified. 3 slaves eventually came to collect Caesar's body. They loaded it onto a litter and carried it home through the quiet city, one arm hanging loose over the side, swaying as they walked. Calpurnia was waiting. Mark Antony was not. Marcus Antonius, Caesar's closest ally, his most loyal general, the man who had stood beside him through a decade of war, had been pulled aside before the assassination began. Deliberately separated from Caesar by Decimus Brutus, kept distracted at the door while the daggers went to work inside. When the news reached him,
My lord, Caesar is dead.
Antony did something the conspirators did not expect. He did not fight, did not rally troops, did not make speeches. He disappeared. For 24 hours, Mark Antony vanished from Rome entirely. The conspirators assumed he had broken, assumed the most dangerous man left alive had decided to survive rather than avenge. They were catastrophically wrong. Antony was thinking, and when he reappeared, calm, composed, dressed in morning black, he came with a request so simple and so devastating that the conspirators, incredibly, agreed to it. He asked to speak at Caesar's funeral.
Brutus said yes. Cassius, who understood people better, said no. They argued. Brutus won. They told themselves it was a gesture of goodwill, a show of confidence, proof that they had nothing to fear from a single speech. They had just handed Mark Antony the most powerful weapon in the Roman world. A crowd of 100,000 people, and a body. Meanwhile, across the city, Caesar's will was read publicly.
To every citizen of Rome, 75 silver coins.
Caesar's private gardens, the most beautiful in Rome, would be open to the public forever. The man they had called a tyrant had left his fortune to the people. Rome began to read the will in silence, and then Rome began to weep. The speech that burned Rome, the Roman Forum. 3 days after the assassination, 100,000 people fill every inch of space, packed into the streets, pressed against columns, climbing onto rooftops for a view. The air smells of torch smoke and grief. Children sit on their father's shoulders, old women clutch their togas. At the center of it all, Caesar's body, laid on a golden couch, draped in the blood-stained toga he died in. The conspirators had also spoken. Brutus had stood before the same crowd and delivered a careful, reasoned, perfectly constructed argument for why Caesar had to die. The crowd had listened. Some had even applauded. Brutus, satisfied, had left the forum before Antony began. That was his second catastrophic mistake of the week. Mark Antony climbed to the podium. He did not shout, did not accuse, did not call for blood. He began quietly. He spoke of Caesar's campaigns, his victories. The wars fought not for personal glory but for Rome, always for Rome. He read from Caesar's will again, slowly, letting each bequest to the Roman people land like a stone dropped into still water. Then he picked up the toga. He held it up before the crowd, the toga Caesar had died in, and turned it slowly so every person in that enormous forum could see the tears, the dark stains, the 23 holes cut by 23 daggers. He said almost nothing. He didn't need to. The crowd broke. What began as weeping became shouting. What became shouting became rage. Within minutes, the forum had transformed from a funeral into something far more dangerous. People began tearing wooden benches from the ground to build a pyre right there in the forum. An illegal act, a sacred space violated, because they could not wait, could not carry Caesar's body to the proper place. They burned him where he fell, and then they went looking for the men who had killed him. The conspirators fled Rome that night. Brutus and Cassius ran east. Others scattered across the empire. The liberatores, the men who had believed Rome would thank them, found themselves hunted through the very streets they had thought to save. In the chaos that followed, a 17-year-old boy arrived quietly in Rome from the provinces. His name was Gaius Octavius, Caesar's adopted son, Caesar's heir. He had read the will. He knew what he was owed, and behind those calm young eyes was a patience and a ruthlessness that no one in Rome, not Antony, not Brutus, not anyone, was yet prepared for. The Republic was already dead. The Empire was about to be born,